She could not wear a normal dress for one single evening. My father threw the words across the Nashville hotel ballroom before I even took my second step on the carpet. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes stopped. The heavy scent of white roses and expensive vanilla candles suddenly felt thick in the back of my throat. I stood frozen in my dress uniform. The stiff collar dug into my neck. "Robert, please," my mother whispered. She stared down at her water glass. My father ignored her. He looked me up and down, from my polished boots to the medals resting on my chest. He let out a slow, cruel laugh. "I asked you to leave the military display at home, Samantha. This is your sister's wedding. But I guess a 38-year-old major cannot handle sharing the spotlight." I gripped the fabric of my trousers. I remembered the text message he sent me 3 hours ago. "Do not show up in that uniform. Do not ruin Emily's day." Emily stood beside him in a cloud of white satin. She reached up and adjusted her veil to hide a smirk. "It is fine, Dad. She is just a soldier. She does not know any better." A few relatives from our family table chuckled. I kept my mouth shut. I had learned a long time ago that standing perfectly still was the only way to survive in a room full of people who wanted you to bleed. I did not fly halfway across the country to fight. I came because I still foolishly thought I belonged to this family. "Pardon me, did I hear someone say Major?" A man in a dark suit stepped away from the groom's side of the room. He held a glass of bourbon. "Where do you serve, Major Whitaker?" Before I could open my mouth, my father stepped right in front of me, cutting off my line of sight to the guest. "Oh," Samantha bounces around, my father said, his voice instantly dropping into that smooth, fake warmth he reserved for strangers. "She does not like to talk about serious stuff. We are just so glad she could make it to the wedding I put together. I spared absolutely no expense for my little girl today. Did you try the crab cakes?" The guest blinked, caught off guard by the aggressive pivot. I took a slow breath and stepped back. The chandelier lights bounced off the gold buttons of my jacket. Let him have his moment. Let him pretend he was the perfect patriarch. Just then, the heavy double doors of the ballroom swung open again. A tall, older man walked in. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, but the way he carried his shoulders screamed military. Daniel, the groom, quickly walked over to greet him. This was General William Harrington, a highly respected friend of the groom's family. He had been delayed at the airport. My father's eyes lit up. He recognized power and status the second they walked into a room. Robert practically shoved past a waiter to get to the front of the greeting line. He adjusted his tie and pasted on a massive, eager smile. "General Harrington." My father practically shouted over the string quartet. "Robert Whitaker, father of the bride. We are so honored you could grace us with your presence." The general offered a polite nod. He reached out to shake my father's hand. But as Harrington turned his head, his eyes landed on me standing in the shadows near the gift table. The general stopped dead in his tracks. He dropped his hand before my father could even grasp it. The entire ballroom went completely silent. The string quartet faded out on a harsh note. General Harrington walked right past my father. He walked past Emily in her stunning gown. He walked past the towering wedding cake and the groom. He stopped less than 2. He straightened his posture. Then, in front of my father, in front of my smirking sister, and in front of every single guest in that room, the general offered me a crisp, perfect salute. "Major Whitaker," General Harrington said, his voice booming through the quiet room. "I was not aware you were part of this family. My son is alive today because of you. It is the greatest honor of my life to finally shake your hand." He extended his hand to me. I took it, my chest tight, with a sudden, overwhelming wave of vindication. I looked over the general's shoulder. My father's face had gone completely pale. His jaw hung slightly open. The fake smile was gone. Emily gripped her bouquet so hard her knuckles turned white. The woman they had just called a mere soldier was suddenly the most respected person in the room. But before my father could recover his pride and open his mouth, a sharp vibration buzzed against my hip. My phone. I pulled it from my pocket, expecting a work alert. It was a text message from Major Denise Cole, a finance officer from my unit. I read the words flashing on the screen. Sam, call me the second you see this. Did you authorize a limited power of attorney to drain your personal reserve account? The glowing letters on my screen felt like a physical blow. A limited power of attorney, my personal reserve account. I stared at the text message from Denise, while the shocked silence in the ballroom slowly shattered around me. My father recovered first. He always did. He plastered that sickeningly warm smile back onto his face and stepped right into my personal space. He threw a heavy arm around my shoulders, gripping me tight enough to bruise my skin through the fabric of my uniform. Well, of course she is a hero, my father announced to the staring crowd. His voice boomed with fake pride. We are incredibly proud of Samantha. She is just too modest to share these military things with her own family. The lie tasted like ash in the air. I stared at the man who had mocked my very presence just a minute ago. General Harrington did not even look at my father. He kept his sharp eyes locked on me. Daniel's father served with me, the general explained to the room. Though his voice carried a quiet respect meant only for me. I came tonight to celebrate his son. I had no idea I would be celebrating the woman who brought my own boy out of a combat zone. A low murmur rippled through the wedding guests. Emily looked like she had swallowed glass. She gripped her white bouquet so hard her knuckles turned completely pale. The phone against my palm vibrated again. Another message from Denise. I needed air. I needed to understand what was happening to my money. Excuse me, General, I said softly. I twisted my shoulder, forcing my father to let go of his bruising grip. I walked past the whispering relatives and pushed through the heavy wooden doors leading out of the ballroom. The thick carpets of the service hallway instantly muffled my footsteps. The rich scent of roasted beef and garlic drifted from the catering kitchen. The low hum of the air conditioning replaced the awkward silence of the string quartet. I dialed Denise immediately. She answered before the first ring finished. Tell me you are looking at your banking application, Denise said. Her voice sounded thin and urgent over the secure connection. I am at a wedding, Denise. What is going on? I am not running an investigation, Sam, my friend replied quickly. But you asked me to help you sort out your financial readiness paperwork before your next deployment. I still had your profile flagged for review in the system. A major warning popped up 20 minutes ago. Someone used a limited power of attorney to authorize a massive withdrawal from your personal reserve account. Cold dread pooled in my stomach. That account held my deployment savings. It was the money I bled for. Those funds were strictly saved for my medical recovery and a future home. I never told anyone about that money except my parents, and only because they asked me for a massive loan 2 years ago. I never signed a power of attorney, I told her. My throat felt incredibly dry. I never gave anyone access to that money. Then you need to move fast, Denise warned. Lock the account right now. Take screenshots of every transaction. Call the bank fraud line immediately. And Sam, whatever you do, do not let anyone in your family touch your phone. The line clicked dead. I lowered the phone slowly. Heavy footsteps echoed at the far end of the hallway. My father marched toward me. His face was twisted in ugly anger. Without the wedding guests watching him, the proud patriarch mask completely melted away. "Who are you calling?" he demanded. His expensive dress shoes clicked sharply against the floorboards near the kitchen entrance. "You are embarrassing your sister. Get back in there and act like a normal person." He reached out to grab my arm. I stepped back, putting physical distance between us. I looked closely at the man who had tried to hide my medals. The man who had just tried to steal General Harrington's respect. The man who thought I was nothing more than an obedient machine meant to fund his perfect life. "Why is your name on my personal reserve account?" I asked. The words left my mouth barely above a whisper. My father froze completely. His hand hovered in the empty air between us. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin looking pale and hollow. For 5 agonizing seconds, he said absolutely nothing. That terrified silence was louder than any confession he could have ever screamed. He finally opened his mouth to construct a lie, but I did not wait to hear it. I took another step back and tapped the banking application on my phone screen. The loading circle spun for a few seconds. Then, the recent transactions populated the screen. Right at the top, a system notification flashed in bold letters. Limited power of attorney accepted. Transfer completed. I stared at the numbers on the screen. The amount withdrawn was staggering. It was practically every single dollar I had saved over 4 years of dangerous combat deployments. It was also the exact estimated cost of a luxury wedding in a downtown Nashville hotel. My father stared at the glowing screen of my phone. The massive withdrawal amount hung in the heavy air between us. For a fraction of a second, the polished and confident Robert Whittaker looked exactly like a cornered animal. His eyes darted toward the ballroom doors, checking to see if anyone had followed us into the quiet service corridor. No one had. We were entirely alone amidst the faint smell of roasted beef and the low drone of the industrial air conditioning. He swallowed hard. Then, he tried to do what he always did. He tried to rewrite reality. "You are confused, Samantha," my father said. His voice took on that patronizing, syrupy tone he used when I was a little girl asking too many questions. "Banking applications make mistakes all the time. System glitches happen. You need to put that device away before you ruin Emily's special evening with your ridiculous paranoia." My thumb hovered over the screen. I locked the device and slid it deep into my uniform pocket. The heavy fabric of my jacket felt suffocating. "A system glitch did not sign a limited power of attorney," I told him quietly, "and a system glitch did not transfer my deployment savings into your personal checking account." Every muscle in my back went completely rigid. That money was not just a random number on a screen. That money was 3 grueling tours of duty. That money was breathing in burning sand, sleeping on cots that smelled of cheap diesel fuel, and enduring months of agonizing physical therapy after a transport vehicle rolled over in the desert. I saved every single penny of my hazard pay so I would have a safety net for my medical recovery. I only told my parents about that personal reserve account 2 years ago when my father called me, crying on the phone, begging for a loan because the house roof was leaking and my mother could not afford her medication. I sent them thousands back then. It was clearly never enough. My father took a step forward, his hands raised in a calming gesture that felt entirely like a physical threat. "We are family," he whispered harshly, stepping closer to my face. "Everything we have belongs to this family. You have been gone for years, playing soldier while we struggled here at home. You owe us this celebration. Emily deserves a beautiful day, and you are acting completely selfish." Disgust coiled hot and sharp in my stomach. I did not scream, I did not cry. Crying was exactly what he wanted. He wanted an emotional daughter he could dismiss as hysterical. "Do not touch me," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I turned my back on him and walked deeper into the service hallway. He called my name, his voice echoing off the painted cinder block walls, but he did not follow. He had a ballroom full of wealthy guests waiting for him to play the perfect host. The service corridor curved around the back of the massive hotel kitchen. Waiters in crisp white shirts rushed past me, carrying silver trays loaded with delicate appetizers. A towering display of imported white orchids sat on a rolling metal cart, waiting to be brought out for the reception. Everything around me reeked of extreme wealth, my stolen wealth. A woman in a sharp black blazer stood near a stack of empty catering crates. She pressed a mobile phone tight against her ear. Her dark hair was pulled into a severe bun, and a wooden clipboard rested against her hip. This was Claire Bennett, the lead wedding planner. She looked incredibly stressed. "Mr. Whitaker promised the final payment cleared this morning," Claire hissed into her phone. She pinched the bridge of her nose. "I know the floral vendor is threatening to pull the centerpieces. Just tell them the bank transfer is pending, please." Claire lowered her phone and finally noticed me standing a few feet away. Her eyes widened, and she took a sudden step backward. The color rapidly drained from her cheeks. She looked exactly like a person caught covering up a crime. "Major Whitaker," Claire stammered. She quickly shoved her phone into her blazer pocket. "Are you looking for the restroom?" "The guest facilities are back toward the main lobby." I stepped closer to her. I kept my posture relaxed and unthreatening, but I held her gaze firmly. "Claire, I need to see the payment schedule for this wedding," I said clearly. The wedding planner crossed her arms over her chest, gripping her clipboard like a physical shield. "I am sorry, but client finances are strictly confidential. I cannot discuss Mr. Whitaker's accounts with anyone else. You understand. My name might be attached to unauthorized transactions paying for this entire event," I replied. "I just need to see the invoices. If my stolen money is paying your vendors, you have a massive legal problem on your hands." Claire swallowed nervously. Her eyes darted toward the swinging kitchen doors. She was wavering. She knew something was horribly wrong with the funding for this party. Before she could answer, heavy footsteps pounded against the linoleum floor. My father rounded the corner, his face flushed dark red with fury. He noticed my absence again and come hunting. "Samantha?" my father barked. He marched right up to us, completely ignoring me to glare fiercely down at Claire. "What are you doing talking to my daughter? You are supposed to be managing the catering staff. Half the champagne glasses at table 4 are empty." Claire stiffened her spine. "Mr. Whitaker, we were just having a brief conversation." "I am not paying you to have conversations," my father snapped. He leaned in, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "I am paying you to do your job. You are the help. So go help the waiters and stop gossiping with my guests, or I will make sure you never book another event in Nashville." The silence in the corridor turned suffocating. Claire stared at my father. The raw fear in her eyes slowly hardened into something else entirely. Resentment. Anger. She watched a man wearing a $5,000 tuxedo treat her like dirt on his shoe. Then she looked over at me. She saw the calm, quiet way I stood my ground against his bullying. "Right away, sir," Claire said smoothly. She gave him a tight, professional nod. My father turned to me, a smug and victorious smile returning to his face. He thought he had won the battle. "Go back inside, Samantha. They are about to serve the main course." He adjusted his silver cufflinks, spun around on his heel, and marched back toward the ballroom to resume his glorious performance. We waited in total silence until the heavy double doors clicked shut behind him. Claire immediately unclipped a thick stack of papers from her board. Her hands shook slightly as she flipped through the dense pages. She pulled out a heavily stapled packet and held it out to me. "This is the master payment schedule," Claire whispered, constantly checking over her shoulder. "The venue, the florist, the live band, the custom dress, everything." I took the warm papers. My eyes scanned the columns of text and numbers. "Mr. Whitaker was frantic 3 weeks ago," Claire explained quietly. "The deposit deadlines were passing. He told me he was waiting for an investment to clear. Then, suddenly, a massive wire transfer hit our agency account. He paid for absolutely everything in one single afternoon." I pulled my phone out and opened my photo gallery. I found the screenshot I had taken of my banking application. The system notification showed the exact date and time the forged limited power of attorney had drained my personal reserve. I held the glowing phone next to Claire's printed payment schedule. The timeline matched perfectly. Less than 2 hours after my deployment savings vanished, the wedding agency received the funds. My father did not just steal from me. He used my blood and sweat to buy imported white roses, a 5-tier cake, and a luxury ballroom just so he could look like a rich, successful patriarch in front of his friends. I flipped to the second page of the invoice packet. Near the bottom corner, a handwritten note was highlighted in bright yellow ink. I read the words twice, feeling a cold numbness spread through my chest. Do not list Sam anywhere, per Robert Whitaker. He stole my money, and then he specifically ordered the wedding planner to erase my name from the entire event. He wanted glory. He wanted endless gratitude from his family. He wanted to wipe my existence away while using my life savings to fund his illusion. I slowly lowered the papers. The betrayal was so absolute, so meticulously planned, that it left no room for doubt or forgiveness. My father was not a desperate man making a tragic mistake. He was a thief who hated his own victim. Claire leaned in closer. She reached out and gently tapped the corner of the invoice packet in my hands. Her voice dropped to an incredibly soft whisper, barely audible over the hum of the kitchen refrigerators. If I show you the email chain discussing those payments, Claire said, your sister is in them too. The wedding planner disappeared back into the bustling catering kitchen, leaving me standing alone in the quiet service corridor. My phone vibrated heavily against my palm. The secure message from my bank had finally finished downloading. A digital copy of the limited power of attorney filled my screen. My thumb hovered over the glowing glass. I slowly zoomed in on the bottom of the second page. Black ink starkly contrasted against the white background. Someone had signed my full legal name. Bile rose in my throat. The letters were entirely wrong. The capital S stood completely straight, lacking the sharp forward slant I always used. The space between my first and last name looked awkwardly wide. The final letter ended in a curled loop instead of my usual abrupt stop. My own father had sat in a room somewhere, held a pen, and carefully practiced stealing my identity. My phone buzzed again, replacing the document with an incoming call from Denise. I answered immediately. "Did you receive the scan?" Denise asked. Her voice sounded tight over the secure connection. "I am looking at it right now," I told her, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "The signature is a complete fake." "Listen to me carefully," Denise instructed. "I am a military finance officer. I am not a civilian attorney, and I have absolutely no authority to investigate your family. But I can tell you as a matter of official record that the signature on that bank document does not match any of your deployment paperwork. You need to lock everything down." "I am calling the fraud department right now," I said. "Good," my friend replied. "Keep your head clear. Gather your evidence. Call me when you are safe." The line went silent. I opened my email archive and found a digital copy of my apartment lease from 2 years ago. I placed the real document next to the forged bank paper on my screen. Seeing them together made the deception painfully obvious. There was no misunderstanding. This was a calculated crime. I dialed the emergency customer service number listed on the back of my bank card. A representative answered after 3 long rings. Her voice sounded cheerful and completely detached from the nightmare unfolding around me. "How may I help you this evening?" the representative asked. "My name is Samantha Whitaker," I said, forcing my breathing to remain steady. "Someone used a forged limited power of attorney to completely drain my personal reserve account." The cheerful tone vanished instantly. The representative switched into a strict procedural mode. She asked for my full name, my mother's maiden name, and my military identification number. I provided every detail while pacing the narrow hallway. "Thank you, Major Whitaker," the representative said after a tense minute of keyboard clicking. "I have officially frozen the account. No further funds can be withdrawn or transferred. We are opening an active fraud investigation. You will need to submit a sworn affidavit regarding the forged signature by tomorrow morning." "What happens to the money that was already taken?" I asked. "The fraud team will track the wire transfer," she explained calmly. "Since the receiving account belongs to a relative, this case will be escalated to our legal department. Do not discuss the investigation with the suspect." I ended the call. The finality of the frozen account felt like a heavy stone settling in my chest. My father could no longer touch my savings. But the damage was already done. The money was currently wrapped around the ballroom pillars in the form of imported white roses. "Samantha?" A soft voice echoed down the corridor. My mother stood near the heavy wooden doors. She wore a pale blue evening gown that made her look fragile and small. Her hands nervously clutched a small silver clutch purse. She had obviously come looking for my father, but her eyes immediately locked onto my glowing phone screen. She walked closer. Her gaze dropped to the digital documents I still had open. She saw the bold heading of the limited power of attorney. She saw the forged signature. My mother did not gasp. She did not ask me who had taken my money. She just closed her eyes and let out a shaky breath. "Not here, Samantha," my mother whispered, looking up at me with pleading eyes. "Please, just put the phone away." My stomach twisted. She knew. She might not have known the exact legal mechanics of the theft, but she knew my father was hiding a massive financial secret, and her first instinct was to protect his reputation. "He forged my name," I told her, my voice eerily calm. "He stole every dollar I saved from my deployments. Your father has been under terrible pressure," she pleaded, reaching out a trembling hand. "We can fix this quietly. Tomorrow. Just come back inside. People are starting to ask questions." Before I could respond, the heavy ballroom doors swung open violently. My father marched into the hallway. His face was dark with genuine rage. He saw my mother pleading with me, and he saw the phone still gripped tightly in my hand. "I told you to stop embarrassing this family," my father snarled. He lunged forward, reaching aggressively toward my hands to snatch the device away. I stepped back quickly, slipping the phone into my uniform pocket. I locked my knees and stood my ground. "Do not touch me. You are ruining your sister's wedding with your pathetic jealousy," he hissed, pointing a sharp finger at my chest. "Hand over the phone right now." "Then stop giving me things to be ashamed of," I replied, my voice slicing through the heavy air like a blade. My father froze, his hand hovering midair. He looked at my mother, expecting her to intervene, but she simply stared at the floor. The patriarch was losing his absolute control, and he knew it. He straightened his tuxedo jacket, let out a disgusted scoff, and grabbed my mother by the elbow. He dragged her back toward the ballroom without another word. I stood alone in the hallway, letting the adrenaline slowly recede. My phone chimed softly from inside my pocket. I pulled it out and opened my email application. A new message had just arrived from Claire Bennett. The subject line read, "Final wedding payment documentation." There was an image attached. It was a screenshot of an email chain between the wedding planner, my father, and Emily. I opened the image and read the very first line my father had typed. "The reserve cleared. Do not list Sam anywhere." The glowing screen illuminated the dim service hallway, casting a harsh blue light over the catering crates. I scrolled past my father's cruel instruction to erase my name from the invoices. Below his message sat a direct reply from my sister. Emily had typed her response only 3 minutes after the massive wire transfer went through. "Perfect," my sister wrote. "She owes this family anyway. She was never really here for us." Heavy footsteps echoed behind me. Emily pushed through the swinging kitchen doors, her massive white gown rustling loudly against the linoleum floor. The heavy scent of her expensive floral perfume instantly filled the narrow space. She looked frantic, her eyes wide and searching. "Sam, what are you doing out here?" Emily demanded, her voice carrying a sharp edge of panic. Dad says you are trying to ruin the reception. You know I do not understand financial things. Dad handles all the money. You cannot blame me for his business decisions. I turned slowly and held my phone up in the air. The bright screen displayed her exact words. Emily stopped moving. Her eyes darted across the illuminated text. The frantic, innocent bride mask completely vanished. Her face hardened, replacing the sweet confusion with a cold and ugly silence. She did not apologize. She did not try to explain. She simply gathered handfuls of her satin skirt, turned around, and fled back into the crowded ballroom. A different set of footsteps approached from the opposite direction. General Harrington stepped out of the shadows near the coat check. He held a crystal glass of sparkling water, watching my sister run away. I suspect there is a terrible war happening behind these flowers, the general said quietly. This is not a battlefield, sir, I replied, keeping my voice steady. It is just a robbery. Harrington nodded slowly. His posture remained perfectly straight. I do not know your family's finances, Major Whitaker. That is a battle you must command yourself, but I know courage when I see it. If you need a man to stand up in that room and verify your honor, you simply give the word. My son breathes today because you never retreated. You deserve to be seen. I thanked him quietly and walked back toward the main ballroom doors. My mother waited right near the entrance. She clutched her silver purse so tightly her knuckles looked badly bruised. A thick and folded paper envelope poked out from the golden clasp. What is in the envelope? I asked her. My mother flinched. It is nothing, Samantha. Just old paperwork. I stepped closer. The edge of the thick paper bore the official embossed seal of the Department of the Army. A memory hit me like a physical blow. 3 years ago, I stood on a wooden stage in a humid gymnasium, thousands of miles away. I received a commendation medal entirely alone. The applause echoed off the tin roof, but none of it belonged to my blood relatives. My father had claimed his phone was broken. Emily had a bridal fitting for her first failed engagement. My mother told me she was simply too tired to travel. I reached out and gently pulled the envelope from her purse. She did not try to stop me. I unfolded the brittle paper under the hallway lights. It was the official mailed invitation to that exact award ceremony. It had been sent directly to their house. My name was printed in bold black ink, right at the top. You knew, I whispered, staring at the woman who gave birth to me. He hid my letters, and you let him do it. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over her carefully applied makeup. He said it would only make your sister feel inadequate. He wanted peace in the house. She traded my dignity for her quiet living room. The betrayal cut significantly deeper than the stolen money. A loud tapping sound echoed from inside the ballroom. Someone was striking a crystal champagne flute with a silver spoon. I pushed past my weeping mother and walked back into the reception. The string quartet had completely stopped playing. The room felt utterly silent as hundreds of guests turned their attention to the main stage. My father stood in front of a towering microphone stand. He held a glass of expensive champagne high in the air. The bright spotlights reflected off his perfect white teeth. He looked completely invincible. I stopped near the center table, keeping my posture rigid and my face completely blank. My phone felt heavy in my pocket, loaded with every piece of evidence required to destroy his illusion. Family and friends, my father announced, his voice booming proudly through the massive speakers. A good father gives absolutely everything for his children. He protects them. He provides for them. Tonight, I am incredibly proud to say that I paid for every single bit of this beautiful wedding. The ballroom echoed with polite applause. My father stood bathed in the bright stage lights, soaking in the admiration of hundreds of wealthy guests. He raised his crystal glass higher, waiting for the clapping to settle before he continued his glorious performance. Emily has always been the light of our family, my father announced into the microphone. His voice dripped with practiced emotion. She stayed close to home. She understands the value of family loyalty. And a loyal daughter deserves nothing but the absolute best on her wedding day. Every flower, every piece of silk, every note of music playing tonight is a gift from me to her. He smiled down at Emily. She wiped a perfectly staged tear from her cheek. My boots made no sound against the thick carpet as I stepped away from the center table. The heavy fabric of my uniform shifted around my shoulders. I did not storm the stage. I walked at a measured, deliberate pace until I stood directly below the microphone stand. "Before we raise our glasses," I said. My voice was completely calm, yet it carried clearly enough to reach the front rows of tables. "I need you to clarify one minor detail for the guests." The ballroom fell absolutely silent. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. My father lowered his champagne glass. His perfect smile hardened into a tight, warning line. "Samantha," my father warned, speaking just loud enough for the microphone to catch his annoyance, "this is not the time for your dramatic outbursts. Go sit down." Emily leaned over her sweetheart table. "You are embarrassing yourself, Sam. Stop trying to ruin my day." I ignored my sister. My eyes remained locked entirely on the man gripping the microphone stand. I reached into my uniform pocket and pulled out my mobile phone. "When you claim you paid for every single bit of this beautiful wedding," I asked, raising my voice so the entire room could hear, "do you mean you paid for it from your personal checking account, or did you pay for it from mine?" A collective gasp rippled through the nearest tables. Relatives exchanged shocked glances. The groom, Daniel, set his glass down on the white tablecloth with a heavy thud. He looked sharply at my father, waiting for a firm denial. My father let out a harsh, patronizing laugh. He gripped the microphone tightly. "You have completely lost your mind. I am not going to stand here and be interrogated by a jealous daughter who could not even bother to wear a proper dress." "Let us ask the wedding planner," I replied smoothly. I turned toward the back of the room where Claire Bennett stood near the kitchen doors. Every head in the ballroom swiveled to follow my gaze. "Claire, could you please tell the guests when the master payment cleared for this venue?" Claire stood perfectly straight. She did not hide behind her clipboard. "The funds cleared exactly 3 hours after a massive wire transfer was initiated, Major Whitaker." "And whose name was specifically excluded from all the invoices?" I asked. "Yours," Claire stated clearly, her voice cutting through the tense silence, per Robert Whitaker's direct written instructions. The whispers swelled into a loud murmur. My father slammed his crystal glass down onto the nearest table. Champagne splashed across the white linen. "She is lying," my father shouted, his face turning an ugly shade of red. He abandoned the microphone and stepped to the edge of the stage. "You think you can just come in here and make wild accusations? You never gave this family a dime. Show me the proof. Show me where I ever signed my name to take your money." He thought he was calling my bluff. He thought the bank procedures would protect his secret for at least another week. I held up my phone, the screen glowing brightly in the dim room. "You did not sign your name," I told him, stepping closer to the stage. "You signed mine." I turned the screen toward Daniel and the front row of guests. The digital copy of the forged, limited power of attorney was open, perfectly zoomed in on the bottom signature line. Beside it, I had opened an official military document bearing my actual handwriting. The difference was glaring. Anyone with functioning eyes could see the forgery. "You stole my deployment savings," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "You forged my signature to drain the personal reserve account I built while breathing sand and recovering from a combat vehicle rollover. You bought these imported roses with my blood." My father realized he was trapped. The physical evidence was sitting right in front of him. His denial evaporated, instantly replaced by a vicious, defensive rage. "You owe us," my father screamed, spittle flying from his lips. He pointed a trembling finger down at me. "You walked out on this family to play soldier, You left your mother alone when she was sick. The military turned you into a cold, heartless machine. I only took what you owed us for abandoning your own blood." He was confessing. He thought his entitlement justified the theft, and he was proudly broadcasting it to a room full of horrified witnesses. I let his words hang in the air until the silence became suffocating. Then, I swiped my thumb across my phone screen, opening the final piece of digital evidence. "If I am so cold and heartless," I said, turning my body slowly toward the sweetheart table, "then maybe Emily can explain why she wrote this." Daniel slowly turned his head to look at his bride. Emily stared back, her face the color of pure chalk. I held the mobile device steady. My voice sliced through the absolute quiet of the ballroom, reaching every single corner of the massive space. "My father wrote that the reserve funds cleared and specifically ordered the wedding planner to keep my name off the financial records," I announced. And my sister replied to that exact message exactly 3 minutes later. Emily stood up so fast her wooden chair scraped violently against the polished dance floor. Her hands shook as she grabbed the edges of the sweetheart table. The heavy, white satin of her gown dragged across the spilled champagne. "I do not understand banking or transfers," Emily cried. Her voice trembled with perfectly practiced tears. "Daniel, please. Dad handles all the business accounts. I am just the bride." I had absolutely no idea where the money came from. My father stepped forward, placing his body between me and the sweetheart table. His hands balled into tight fists at his sides. "Leave your sister out of this nightmare. You are a terrible person for doing this on her special day." "I did not write the response email," I replied, keeping my eyes locked entirely on the groom. "Emily did, and her exact words were, 'She owes this family anyway. She was never really here for us.'" A collective gasp rippled through the front row of decorated tables. Relatives covered their mouths. Daniel did not gasp. He did not yell. He simply turned his entire body to face the woman he was supposed to marry. His expression remained completely unreadable, a blank mask that seemed far more terrifying than sudden anger. "Did you know?" Daniel asked. His voice was incredibly quiet, yet it carried a heavy weight that made the room feel suffocating. Emily opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked past her groom, searching desperately for our father to save her from the collapsing lie. But Robert Whitaker stood frozen, trapped by the overwhelming presence of hundreds of watching guests. That single second of terrified silence was the loudest confession Emily could ever make. "Daniel, you have to listen to me," Emily pleaded, reaching out to grab the lapels of his black tuxedo jacket. He stepped backward, letting her hands grasp empty air. The sweet and innocent bride mask finally shattered into a million sharp pieces. Emily whipped her head toward me, her face contorting into pure venom. "You always do this to me," Emily screamed, completely abandoning her fragile act. "You always have to be the center of attention. You chose the military over us. You left us behind in Nashville. That money should belong to the family. You did not even need it tonight." She sounded exactly like our father. The toxic entitlement ran deep in her veins, poisoning the pristine image she had spent months building. Daniel stared at her, as if he were looking at a complete stranger. He slowly reached down and picked up his crystal champagne glass from the table. For a brief moment, the heavy silence made it seem like he might throw the expensive vessel. Instead, he set it down on the nearest empty catering tray with a soft and final clink. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the simple gold wedding band they had exchanged just hours ago, and placed the ring right next to the glass. "If this is what you call family," Daniel said, his voice completely hollow and devoid of any warmth, "I do not want to become part of it." He turned around and walked straight down the center aisle. He did not look back. His parents immediately stood up from the front table and followed their son toward the exit doors. Emily let out a shattered wail and collapsed into her chair, burying her face in her hands. The perfect wedding was officially dead. My father watched the wealthy groom walk out the door, taking the prestigious family connection and his elevated social status with him. The ultimate patriarch had just lost his greatest prize. His face turned a deep and dangerous shade of purple. He spun around and marched aggressively toward me. "I took what she owed us," my father roared, waving his arms frantically toward the exiting guests. "She is a selfish brat who owes this family everything." He was completely out of control, blinded by his own shattered pride. He did not even notice the glowing red light on the tall metal tripod set up near the edge of the main stage. The hired videographer had left the camera rolling. A young bridesmaid stood near the recording equipment, staring down at her mobile phone in absolute horror. "The wedding live stream is still running," the bridesmaid whispered. Her voice carried just enough for the front row of silent guests to hear. "The comments are going crazy." Everyone heard him admit it. My father froze. His eyes darted toward the camera lens. The crushing realization hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. His proud and angry confession was no longer contained within these walls. He had just broadcasted his own theft to the entire world. The glowing red recording light on the camera tripod blinked in the dim room like a silent alarm. The crushing reality of the open broadcast finally broke the paralyzing spell holding the reception captive. Chairs began scraping violently against the polished hardwood floor. Low whispers rapidly escalated into loud and frantic conversations. The perfect illusion of the wealthy family was completely shattered. Guests at the back tables stood up first. They did not stop to offer condolences. They simply grabbed their expensive wraps and headed straight for the heavy exit doors. The string quartet musicians quietly packed their wooden instruments into velvet cases. Waiters carrying silver trays of untouched champagne slowly backed into the catering kitchen, instructed by Claire to clear the floor. Emily staggered out from behind her decorated table. The heavy satin of her wedding gown dragged through a puddle of spilled wine. Her elaborate hairstyle had started to fall apart, leaving blonde curls plastered against her damp cheeks. She looked around at the fleeing guests and let out a broken, furious sob. "You destroyed the best day of my entire life!" Emily screamed, marching toward me with her hands clenched into tight fists. Her voice cracked under the weight of her own entitlement. "You always wanted to ruin everything for me. You are a monster." I did not flinch or take a single step back. I looked at the imported white orchids towering over the empty tables. I looked at the massive 5-tier cake sitting untouched under a crystal chandelier. "I did not ruin anything," I told my sister calmly. "You simply built your perfect day using stolen money. The foundation was always going to collapse." Emily let out another agonizing wail, completely unable to process the truth. She turned away and collapsed into a nearby chair, burying her face against the white linen tablecloth. Her tears ignited a final spark of toxic rage inside our father. Robert Whittaker could not accept defeat. He could not accept that his carefully crafted reputation had just burned to the ground on a public broadcast. His face contorted into a mask of pure hatred. He lunged across the dance floor, aiming directly for the mobile phone still clutched in my hand. "Give me that device right now," my father roared. His arms reached out aggressively to grab my wrists. Before his fingers could even brush the fabric of my uniform, a broad shoulder blocked his path. 2 venue security guards in sharp dark suits had stepped out from the hallway shadows. One guard firmly planted his hand against my father's chest, pushing the angry patriarch backward with effortless strength. "Step back, sir," the security guard ordered, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Keep your hands to yourself." My father stumbled backward. His expensive tuxedo jacket bunched awkwardly around his shoulders. He looked wildly around the room, searching for someone to defend him. But the remaining relatives just stared at him in quiet horror. The powerful and generous family man was gone. In his place stood a pathetic, desperate thief who had just been caught trying to assault his own daughter. A soft sob echoed near my left shoulder. My mother stepped out from the shadows near the entrance. She looked incredibly frail. Her pale blue evening gown seemed to swallow her small frame. She walked past her ruined husband and stopped a few feet in front of me. Her hands trembled violently as she clutched her silver purse. "Please, Samantha," my mother begged, her voice barely a whisper above the chaotic noise of the evacuating ballroom. "Please, stop this. Just put the phone away and let us go home. Think of the family." I looked into her pleading eyes. She was still trying to keep the sinking ship afloat. She was still asking me to sacrifice my dignity to buy her a quiet living room. "When did this family ever think of me?" I asked her softly. My mother closed her eyes and let out a shaky breath. She did not have an answer. I reached out and gently pulled the folded paper envelope from her shaking hands. It was the same thick envelope she had been hiding all evening. The embossed seal of the military department felt heavy against my fingertips. I slid my thumb under the flap and pulled out the brittle paper hidden inside. The bright ballroom lights illuminated the crisp black text. It was an official commendation letter from 3 years ago. The military had mailed it directly to my parents, praising my bravery during a chaotic rescue mission in a burning desert compound. It was undeniable proof of my honor. "He hid this from the rest of the family," I said, holding the letter up so she could see the faded ink. "He hid my medals. He hid my commendations. He told everyone I was just a cold soldier who never visited. And you knew he was doing it." My mother dropped her gaze to the floor. Fresh tears spilled over her cheeks. "How many letters did he hide in his desk?" I pressed, my voice shaking for the very first time that night. The financial betrayal was a massive crime, but this silence was a devastating emotional wound. "How many times did you sit at the dinner table and let me believe I had absolutely nothing to be proud of?" "He said you were already too brave," my mother sobbed, wrapping her arms around her own stomach. "He said if we praised you, you would just keep volunteering for dangerous missions. He wanted you to feel small so you would finally come back home." Her confession was worse than any calculated lie. They had deliberately starved me of affection, hoping the terrible hunger would force me to surrender my independence. Across the dance floor, my father shoved the security guard's arm away. He straightened his ruined posture and glared at me with absolute disgust. He had lost his stolen money, his pristine reputation, and his golden child's entire future. "You ruined this family!" my father shouted, pointing a trembling finger across the empty space between us. The remaining guests froze. The catering staff stopped moving. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, waiting to see how the disgraced soldier would react to her father's final desperate condemnation. I looked at the weeping bride. I looked at the cowardly mother. I looked at the broken, furious patriarch. I took a long, deep breath, letting the heavy scent of melted vanilla candles fill my lungs one last time. The echo of my father accusing me of ruining the family bounced off the high ceiling of the ballroom. His finger trembled in the air. His face was twisted into a mask of complete desperation. I looked at the weeping bride slumped over her sweetheart table. I looked at the cowardly mother hiding in the shadows. I looked at the broken, furious patriarch who had built his entire kingdom on a foundation of stolen money and buried truth. I took a long, deep breath, letting the heavy scent of melted vanilla candles fill my lungs one last time. "No," I said quietly. My voice remained perfectly steady, cutting through the toxic air. I stopped paying for the lie. I turned my back on Robert Whittaker. I did not wait for his response. My polished boots clicked against the hardwood floor in a slow, measured rhythm. I pushed open the heavy wooden double doors of the ballroom and walked out into the quiet hotel lobby. The cool night air conditioning washed over my face, completely erasing the suffocating smell of imported white roses and spilled champagne. I did not sleep that night. I sat at a small desk in my own hotel room, staring at the bright glow of my laptop screen. I opened the official fraud reporting portal for my banking institution. I uploaded the digital scan of the forged limited power of attorney. I attached the screenshots of the massive wire transfer. I uploaded the clear photographs of the wedding planner invoices. Finally, I attached a screen recording of the wedding live stream, capturing the exact moment my father proudly confessed to taking what he believed I owed him. I hit submit and watched the progress bar turn solid green. The consequences did not happen overnight. There were no flashing police lights outside the wedding venue. True accountability moves slowly, but when it finally arrives, it crushes everything in its path. 6 months later, the cold autumn wind had faded into a mild and rainy spring. The banking institution did not treat the forgery as a simple family misunderstanding. They treated it as a severe case of financial fraud and identity theft. The civilian legal system took over entirely. My father faced absolute ruin. The civil court ordered full restitution for the stolen deployment savings. Because he had already spent the funds on the lavish wedding, he did not have the liquid cash to repay the bank. The court placed a massive lien on his beautiful suburban house. His personal checking accounts were frozen. The financial penalty was devastating, but the social cost destroyed his spirit completely. The video clip of his angry confession had circulated through his entire network. His prestigious country club quietly revoked his membership. His wealthy golfing partners suddenly stopped answering his phone calls. The proud patriarch who demanded absolute respect from everyone around him became a toxic pariah in his own hometown. My father lost his kingdom, but my sister lost her illusion. Daniel never came back. His wealthy family officially demanded their venue and catering deposits returned. The expensive crystal wedding gifts were boxed up and shipped back to the confused guests. Without the groom, the perfect golden daughter lost her elevated social status. Emily was forced to sell her custom satin gown and her diamond engagement ring just to pay off the remaining vendor debts my father could no longer cover. She called my mobile phone exactly one time during those 6 months. Her voice was bitter and completely void of any real remorse. "You got exactly what you wanted," Emily hissed into the receiver. "You destroyed us." I hung up the phone without saying a single word. I owed her no explanations, and I owed her no apologies. My mother tried a different approach. She asked to meet me in the parking lot of a quiet diner near the county courthouse on the day the final civil settlement was signed. The air smelled of wet asphalt and old frying grease. My mother looked incredibly fragile. Her hair had gone entirely gray, and her hands shook as she clutched her coat around her shoulders. "We can still fix this, Samantha," my mother pleaded, reaching out to touch my sleeve. "Your father is sorry. The money is being returned. We can just go back to being a family." I stepped back, keeping a firm physical distance between us. I looked at the woman who had held my official military commendations in her hands and chose to hide them in a dark drawer to protect a fragile peace. "I hope one day you understand the difference between peace and silence," I told her gently. I turned around, walked to my car, and drove away, leaving her standing alone in the damp parking lot. The stolen funds were eventually recovered and deposited back into my personal reserve account. But I did not keep the money sitting in the dark. I used a large portion of my returned savings to establish a special financial program for the children of wounded and fallen soldiers. I wanted the money that almost bought a fake wedding to buy real futures for families who had actually sacrificed something for their country. We held a small dedication ceremony on a bright Tuesday morning in early April. The sun warmed the green grass of the military base courtyard. I wore my dark dress uniform. The brass buttons caught the bright morning light. The heavy fabric felt like a shield, comfortable and perfectly tailored. General Harrington stood proudly by my side on the wooden podium. He smiled as he looked out at the small crowd of military families. He did not look at me with pity. He looked at me with profound respect. My father had once pointed his finger at me in a crowded ballroom and laughed, calling me just a soldier to make himself feel tall. He wanted me to spend my entire life desperately seeking his validation. But as the general turned toward me and loudly introduced Major Whitaker to the cheering crowd, I realized the ultimate truth. I did not need to look toward the back rows to see if my family was watching. I did not need their applause anymore. I stood perfectly straight, my shoulders pulled back, and smiled. I was finally proud of myself first. "You ruined this family," my father shouted. His voice cracked, echoing off the high ceiling of the devastated ballroom. His trembling finger remained pointed directly at my chest. I looked at him. I looked at the sobbing bride slumped over her sweetheart table. I looked at the mother hiding in the shadows, clutching her silver purse full of hidden commendations. I took a slow and deep breath. The suffocating scent of spilled champagne and melting vanilla candles filled my lungs for the absolute last time. "No," I replied, keeping my voice incredibly calm. I stopped paying for the lie. I turned my back on Robert Whitaker. I did not wait for another screaming accusation. My polished boots stepped over the scattered white rose petals, moving in a steady and measured rhythm. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the ballroom and walked straight into the quiet hotel lobby. The cool air conditioning instantly washed over my face, carrying away the toxic heat of that room forever. An hour later, I sat at the small desk in my hotel room. The glow of my laptop screen illuminated the dark walls. I did not call the local police. I opened the official fraud reporting portal for my banking institution. I uploaded the digital scan of the forged limited power of attorney. I attached the screenshots of the massive wire transfer. I uploaded the clear photographs of the wedding planner invoices. Finally, I attached the screen recording of the wedding live stream, capturing the exact moment my father proudly confessed to taking what he believed I owed him. I pressed the submit button. The loading bar turned solid green. There were no flashing sirens or dramatic arrests. True accountability moves quietly, but it crushes absolutely everything in its path. 8 months passed. The cold autumn wind faded into a bright and humid summer. The banking institution did not treat the forgery as a simple family misunderstanding. They escalated the incident to a severe case of financial fraud and identity theft. The civilian legal system took over entirely. My father faced absolute ruin. The civil court ordered full restitution for the stolen deployment savings. Because he had already spent the funds on the lavish wedding, he did not have the liquid cash to repay the massive debt. The court placed a heavy lien on his beautiful suburban house. His personal checking accounts were frozen pending the final settlement. The financial penalty was devastating, but the social cost destroyed his spirit completely. The video clip of his angry confession had circulated through his entire network. His prestigious country club quietly revoked his membership. His wealthy golfing partners stopped taking his calls. The proud patriarch who demanded absolute respect became a toxic pariah in his own hometown. My father lost his kingdom, and my sister lost her illusion. Daniel never returned. His wealthy family officially demanded their venue and catering deposits back. The expensive crystal wedding gifts were boxed up and shipped back to the confused guests. Without the groom, the perfect golden daughter lost her elevated social status. Emily was forced to sell her custom satin gown just to pay off the remaining vendor debts my father could no longer cover. She called my mobile phone exactly one time during those 8 months. Her voice sounded bitter and completely void of any real remorse. "You got exactly what you wanted," Emily hissed into the receiver. "You destroyed us." I hung up the phone without saying a single word. I owed her no explanations, and I owed her absolutely no apologies. My mother tried a different approach. She asked to meet me in the parking lot of a quiet diner near the county courthouse on the day the final civil settlement was signed. The air smelled of wet asphalt and old frying grease. My mother looked incredibly frail. Her hair had gone entirely gray, and her hands shook as she clutched her thin coat around her shoulders. "We can still fix this, Samantha," my mother pleaded, reaching out to touch my sleeve. "Your father is sorry. The money is being returned today. We can just go back to being a family." I stepped back, keeping a firm, physical distance between us. I looked at the woman who had held my official military commendations in her hands and chose to hide them in a dark drawer to protect a fragile peace. "I hope one day you understand the difference between peace and silence," I told her gently. I turned around, walked to my car, and drove away. The stolen funds were eventually recovered and deposited back into my personal reserve account. I did not keep the money sitting in the dark. I used a large portion of my returned savings to establish a special financial program for the children of wounded and fallen soldiers. I wanted the money that almost bought a fake wedding to buy real futures for families who had actually sacrificed something for their country. We held a small dedication ceremony on a bright Tuesday morning. The sun warmed the green grass of the military base courtyard. I wore my dark dress uniform. The brass buttons caught the bright morning light. The heavy fabric felt like a shield, comfortable and perfectly tailored. General Harrington stood proudly by my side on the wooden podium. He smiled as he looked out at the small crowd of military families. He did not look at me with pity. He looked at me with profound respect. My father had once pointed his finger at me in a crowded ballroom and laughed, calling me just a soldier to make himself feel tall. He wanted me to spend my entire life desperately seeking his validation. But as the general turned toward me and loudly introduced Major Whitaker to the cheering crowd, the old insult completely lost its power. I did not need to look toward the back rows to see if my family was watching. I did not need their applause anymore. I stood perfectly straight, my shoulders pulled back, and smiled. I was finally proud of myself first. Sometimes you spend your entire life trying to buy the approval of people who are supposed to love you unconditionally. You shrink yourself down, hide your own medals, and pay for their comfortable lies just to keep the peace. But true family does not demand your silence as the price of admission. The hardest lesson you will ever learn is that you cannot heal a toxic dynamic by giving more of yourself to people who only know how to take. You have the absolute right to stop paying for illusions and to walk away from any table where respect is no longer served. Your worth is never determined by those who refuse to see it. Have you ever had to make the painful choice to walk away from someone you love just to protect your own dignity? Share your story in the comments below, because you are never walking alone.